where they both are today, zooming into us. And Nick is going to tell you more about his background, but I hear that he is extremely qualified to talk about returning to work because he has both a toddler and a new baby at his home. So he's very excited to be back in the office.
Yeah.
So again, thanks so much to both of you, and thank you to Allen Matkins for being our sponsor. And take it away.
That sounds good. Thank you, Jennifer. And you're right, we go back a long way, but we won't say how long because that would give away our ages. And you know, you're never required to do that. Let me just start out by saying, give you just a brief overview of what we'll be talking about here today. And, you know, every day we're besieged with news about what tier we're in and who is going back to work and when are they going back to work and how are they doing it. Nick's going to start out by taking you through a few of the laws that have been in place. We've all heard a lot about those, so we won't belabor that point. This is really intended to be more practical and a whole lot of gray. There are no set answers on the best way to return to work. And it is something that everybody is doing for the first time. So it's really more ideas and things to keep in mind as you're going through. We'll talk about what other companies are doing, what some best practices are, and then to keep you here till the end, vaccination is kind of the last topic that we will have on the agenda. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you to start that review.
Great, thank you, Amy. And as Amy mentioned, I'm going to be going through some of the COVID-19 laws that have been passed in the last year here in California. And I think a lot of us are probably aware of these, but we wanted to give everybody kind of a brief overview of where we are in terms of what's been passed and what is still in effect that employers may want to continue thinking about. So the first one that was passed was the 2020 COVID-19 Supplemental Paid Sick Leave Law. And that was applied to California employers with 500 or more employees nationwide. The legislator basically designed that to capture any employers that were not covered by the federal law that was passed earlier in the year last year. And so that provided up to 80 hours of paid leave for reasons relating to COVID-19. And that expired at the end of last year. And earlier this year, Governor Newsom signed into law the 2021 COVID-19 Supplemental Paid Sick Leave Law, and that went into effect in late March. And it's essentially just an extension of the 2020 law that had already expired. And so again, right now, employees working for companies with 500 or more employees are entitled to up to 80 hours of paid leave for reasons relating to COVID-19. One of the bigger ones that remains in effect and has a lot of different issues that employers need to be aware of are the Cal OSHA emergency temporary standards that relate to COVID-19. And so these were published shortly before Thanksgiving of last year when OSHA issued emergency temporary standards. And among other things, these standards require employers of all sizes to implement a written COVID-19 prevention program, to implement various preventative measures within the workplace, record keeping requirements, and management and investigation of COVID-19 cases and outbreaks in the workplace. As I said, these standards are currently in effect right now, and there's no expiration date for them. And the last one that we're going to talk about is the COVID-19 workers' compensation presumption that was passed in Senate Bill 1159. This was signed into law by Governor Newsom in September of last year, and the bill essentially creates a rebuttable presumption that certain employees who test positive for COVID-19 actually contracted the virus at work for workers' compensation purposes. Now, employers can dispute that presumption, but they have to put forward evidence such as measures the employer put in place to reduce transmission of COVID in the workplace, or things that they know the employee may have done outside of the workplace that could have contributed to a risk of COVID-19 infection. And so that remains in effect today and does not expire until 2023. And so the next thing we're going to talk about are the current state and local guidelines and kind of where we are and how that affects reopening. And so right now, as many of you probably know, we have the tier color-coded system that groups counties into various colors and ranges depending on the level of infection and test positivity rates in those counties. And so this tiered system allows for varying levels of activities depending on what's happening in the county. Now, Governor Newsom did announce that June 15th is the date the state is targeting for fully reopening the economy. And that's going to be tied to both what they've titled equitable vaccine availability and a consistently low burden of disease throughout the state. The state has announced that at that time, they're going to be phasing out this tiered guidance and that new guidance will likely be forthcoming. And so some of you may recall that last year, the California Department of Public Health published various guidelines for office-based businesses or retail businesses and things that employers needed to comply with. So those guidelines are likely going to be phased out in June. But the state is going to continue mandating masking and will likely be implementing other measures that probably don't quite go to the level of what we saw last year, but there's still going to be guidelines. And so right now, many counties are in the orange tier of Governor Newsom's tiered system, which allows offices to reopen in those counties. And so as you can see, all of the major counties, San Diego, Los Angeles, Orange County, San Francisco, and Santa Clara, you can reopen offices in the orange tier that they're in. And some of those counties are going to be moving into the yellow tier next week. It's likely going to be Los Angeles and San Francisco County. But even when you can move into those counties, the state is still encouraging employers to continue to encourage their employees to telework and not come into the office at that time. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and she's going to talk a little bit next.
So let's talk about it, right? We've had a lot of starts and stops. I know last June is for the first time when there was serious discussion about reopening workplaces. And a lot of my clients and myself on behalf of my own law firm went to great efforts to set up reopening plans and guidelines and how were we going to do it and the staggered return and social distancing and all of those things. And 2 weeks after we did our staggered reopenings, we were shut down again. And that was in July of last year. And I think a lot of companies since then have not even truly broached a start date on when to begin again. Every day we hear new things about what the new regulations are going to be, whether it's going to be June 15th with the reopening, but there'll be new guidelines. And so there has been a lot of work that has been done that ended up never turning into a plan that was actually acted upon, because before the plan was put into effect, new regulations had come out. Much of this, and a lot is being said of the large companies that make public announcements about what they are doing, what they are planning to do. And that's kind of what the slide suggests. In April, occupancy in offices in major cities was at 26%. So that's a pretty, that means you got 75% almost that are not open in your major cities. And looking at what kind of the plans are for some of the big players. Most companies are now saying that they do intend to return to physical presence in the office. And some have a variety of dates. September is a very popular one, in large part when you talk to the people making the decisions, because they kind of want the dust to settle. They want the summer months to people to take their vacations if they're going to still have that flexibility of working from home, less concerns about daycare and how to to take care of that function of things, with the thought that by the fall, many, if not all, schools will be reopened, and it'll just be an easier transition back into the office. The other thing to kind of keep in mind, and what many companies are doing, these September dates that you see, those are when there will be an expectation of returning to the office. A lot of companies are going with a voluntary return at earlier time frames. So using the summer months for those who are comfortable returning to the office, to get them back into the office, get their systems back in place, get used to what they're doing. Interestingly, many companies have done employee surveys, and Nick, if you can switch to the next slide, there is certainly a difference of opinion between those in charge and those who are the employees that are working as to how much, how soon, how often they want to return to the office. And I think there is no doubt that there will be a change in the way many companies work, and the agreement or recognition of productive work being conducted when someone is home. And you'll see here, this was a survey that was done in March, and 87% of employees who have been working remotely would prefer to continue working remotely at least one day per week post-pandemic. 42% of current remote workers say if their company does not continue to offer remote work options long-term, they'll look to find a company that does. And that's one to keep in mind, and that retention analysis has gone both ways. It has been, and I don't have the numbers, but anecdotally from my clients, I've heard time and time again that there has been a lot of employee mobility during the pandemic, and questions as to why that might be. One of the reasons is because there is less of a connection to your employer when your job, your employment, is really just your computer screen and how good the technology is. And you're sitting at home, it doesn't matter who you go to lunch with, you're going to lunch with the people at your house. You are not worried about what the parking's like at the building, or the happy hours that your company has, or whether it's located in a desirable area. And you also have that time when you're online to check out other companies and figure out what they are doing, and perhaps to follow the more streamlined benefits of Simply Pay or things of that nature, as opposed to the camaraderie in the sense of belonging to a particular company. Notably, the surveys have shown that employees do acknowledge that it is and can be more difficult to work from home and more difficult to feel motivated when you're working at home, and harder to balance home life and work life, and harder to turn off the computer at a certain set time, because the personal life and the work life have blended together. So you have people who are, answering the door for the delivery person, or taking the dog for a midday walk, or picking their children up from school, such that they tell themselves, I'll just fill this in the 7 to 9 o'clock time frame at night, or other things. So it really has, and we've seen many studies about the emotional impact and the increase in EAP claims and stress and anxiety and not feeling like you can turn it off. Last point on this slide is it was pretty evenly split as to whether it was men or women who wanted to continue to work from home and work in that home environment, which many people were surprised to see. They thought there would be a greater percentage of women who wanted to continue to work from home from the child care perspective, but that did not turn out to be the case. Turning now and kind of talking about your return to the workplace. There has been this discussion and sentiment that we're all in this together and that we're all suffering through this and we have similar experiences. That's somewhat true, but not entirely true. It is dramatically different from for a single person to be working from home versus a young parent like Nick, of toddlers and the noise and distraction versus the kids who are in school, where you're also homeschooling your children, versus those who have adult children or don't have any children. Or, and the reality of those situations is really very different. You also have an enormous span of reactions and practices during COVID. There are some people who have not left their house and have still really not left, maybe a 1 mile radius of their homes. There are other people that have been taking advantage of every opportunity up until something is shut down and returning to it the moment that it reopens. There are some people who are traveling and have been able to travel throughout the state, throughout the country. Again, there are other people who have not done any of those things. And the return to daily interactions with a number of people, it's going to be a very dramatically different experience for those people. The other thing to keep in mind is everyone has a different level of comfort, and I've seen this in a lot of different workplaces. One group will have what they think are best practices to stay safe during COVID, and another group does different things that they think are critically important to stay safe during COVID. Both have opinions about what the other groups are doing and how they're handling things. And whether it be from masks or distancing or hand washing or whatever it might be, there are many, many, many different approaches. Probably the most important thing I can express to anyone is the need for patience during this return program. We talked about patience when we were all going to working at home, and we're going to need just that same amount of patience when we return to the office. Day one is not going to be seamless, and day one is not going to be a particularly productive day from a outflow of work. So some of the things, and again, we mentioned this earlier, but staggering the returns. So perhaps it's a drop dead, not drop dead, that's a bad term. Perhaps it is a date of September after Labor Day when you will have the vast majority of people returning, with people who are more comfortable doing that in an earlier time frame. It's also having staggered returns that perhaps you have people who are coming in 2 or 3 days a week, and then a different group, similar to what you're seeing in the schools, of those people returning. Because the people who come back the first will be much more comfortable than the people who are returning later on. So you have, every time you bring in new people, they are going to be nervous and anxious, whereas the people who have been at work for a week or 2 weeks or a month are much more comfortable and have now gone a month, they've figured out the routines, and again, keeping in mind what your workplace is and how you want to do that. Interestingly, a lot of the social distancing protocols that we have put into place are continuing to decrease, both as we have an increase in the vaccination and the numbers are going down. We have this at least 6 feet sign here. We now know from schools that it's probably more like 3 feet. But it depends on where you are. The thing that I would emphasize, keep in mind that you need to have, human resources will likely come up with policies and protocols and what's going to happen. Don't overstate why you are putting particular safety measures into place. There is this tendency to say this is a requirement by the CDC. It is really unlikely that it may be an actual CDC requirement. I actually travel around the state a lot, and I was in LA yesterday, I'm in Orange County today, I'll be in San Diego later this afternoon. Even just going to the baseball stadiums in those different venues, wildly different protocols that have been put into place. And each venue says that they are doing it based on the state guidelines. And yet they're dramatically different how they are approaching it, where people are standing, how they're interacting, what is required. And the reason why I bring that up is it is completely fine and acceptable for your company to put safety measures into place. But make sure that you don't say the CDC requires this, if what it really is your company's determination as to what the best practice for your workplace is. Because you can be more stringent than what the technical CDC guidelines might be. And the CDC guidelines typically are just that, they're guidelines that you need to incorporate into your workforce and with your staff. You also need to make sure that it's not just someone from human resources that is making a policy without checking with the individual supervisors and managers. You need buy-in from those managers so that they agree with what measures are being put into place and that they're going to comply with them as well. So for instance, if you are going to have conference room meetings that would meet the CDC guidelines where people are spaced and you have airflow and whatever it might be, human resources, if they put in a requirement that says no more than 2 people per conference room or no more than 4 people per conference room, but it's a conference room that could fit normally 40 people and under CDC guidelines could fit 10 people. Make sure that you have that buy-in, because the supervisor that wants to have a team meeting and have 6 people in the conference room, you don't want that to get set up and then HR comes through and say, oh, you can't have that meeting. And what are you doing? You violated the policy. You need to, back away from that. We're gonna call the meeting, right? And you will have a lot of people and high-level people that don't read through your entire reopening plan, don't remember all of the things and the protocols that are put in there. More than anything, and we've seen this with offices that have reopened, your HR team and your supervisors need to be prepared that you are going to get a lot of complaints. And it is going to be in kind of the finger pointing zone where you will have people telling you, so-and-so didn't wear their mask. So-and-so got on the elevator when I was on the elevator and I felt really uncomfortable. So-and-so, there's going to be a lot of that. And again, there's no perfect way of answering those questions other than to say, be ready for them, be patient, encourage coworkers to be patient with each other, encourage coworkers to feel comfortable to state their concerns directly, but pleasantly. It's fine to say, I'd really prefer that you not ride the elevator with me. Don't mean to be, rude, but, could you keep your distance? Those types of things, and just empower your workforce for people to say if they feel uncomfortable, and for people not to feel upset if someone does say, could you put your mask on? Could you, step back? And it really, it's going to take a lot of patience for people to be able to get comfortable with returning to the workplace. Nick, I'm going to have you move on to the next slide. As I mentioned, not everyone is going to be comfortable returning to the office right away. And the question, and this will come up later too, is what do we do when someone says, I don't want to come back to the workplace? That is part of the reason why we are recommending a staggered period of returning, where you have people who are comfortable to come back first and have a later date to kind of ease back in other people who might have a level of discomfort. The only, a mere level of discomfort does not mean that's not a legally protected right to not come back to the workplace. And it is also not legally protected for someone to say, well, my mother lives with me and she has underlying health conditions. And now, having said it's not legally protected, that doesn't mean that your company might not want to consider those types of requests. And Nick will go into policies a little bit later, but it's something that you should be thinking about now, how you're going to address those types of concerns. There may be, and this is important to keep in mind too, different companies have different workflows and workforces, but even within your company, you have different functions. And there are certain functions that it is just fine to be remote, and that you don't need to be in the office, and that you've really learned that during the last year or so, that you don't necessarily need to be in the office. There are other functions that there is a huge benefit to the company to have people back physically. And I've heard this from a lot of tech companies and tech clients of mine, that the collaboration of being in a conference room and working out some new technology or new approach, or the technology glitch that is going on, it really does make a difference for people to physically be present. But that might not be the case for a different department in your company. And it is okay to treat different departments differently, to have different policies, to have different approval processes. Bottom line, what you need to do is you need to be certain that you are not making decisions for any of the protected reasons, right? You can't decide you're going to make a group stay in the office because they're a certain age or a certain gender or a certain nationality. It needs to be a legitimate business reason as you're making those decisions about who is required to come back to the office, who might be permitted to work remotely. But communication is really key, and that's something you want to make sure you're staying in front of. You want to make sure that it's not a 1 week type situation where you say, okay, June 15th came, and on June 10th, you decide that you're going to tell your employees to be back the next Monday. You really want to give people as much heads up as to when and what you are expecting as you can. And sometimes that's simply saying, we don't know what it's going to look like, but you're not going to be back into the office until the Tuesday after July 4th weekend. That gives them, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe a month now of trying to get their affairs in order and kind of mentally getting back into the flow of, I'm going to have to be back into an office environment. And there's having your human resources available to talk through with people what their concerns are. Again, it's really important, and it's time well spent to use that resource that you have in-house. Nick, I'm going to have you switch to the next slide, which is talking about accommodations. The accommodations that you need to keep in place, and this goes both towards people needing for medical reasons who cannot return to the office, but also when we talk about vaccinations, which we'll get to later, you need to make accommodations and engage in the interactive process, both for disability and medical conditions, but also for religious beliefs and observances. So keep in mind, you've got both of those to consider. Historically, I have had so many disability accommodation cases where the answer was always, we don't provide remote work opportunities, employees have to be in the office, we insist upon that. That is not going to be a viable answer going forward, because we know, with the exception of people who, the cook in the restaurant, we know that you can do it remotely, and virtually every job has that opportunity of doing things remotely, and successfully so. So you really are going to have a difficult time going forward saying that remote work is not an option. So be prepared for that as we move ahead. I'm going to turn it back over to Nick to go through some of the legal issues with the people who have been working remotely and making sure you're getting these things tied up before you get back to a physical presence.
Thanks, Amy. So there are a number of legal issues that have been affecting clients and employers over the last year as a result of shifting most of their workforce to a work from home environment. And these issues affect both exempt and non-exempt employees in different ways. there are a lot of wage and hour issues that are important for employers to consider, particularly for their non-exempt employees. As everybody knows, employers are required to pay employees for all hours worked, which includes work not requested but permitted. And so there is a lot of potential to create liability for employers by having employees sign on after hours to respond to quick emails. So if you have a non-exempt employee that is typically working 9 to 5, but is also responding to emails at 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night, technically they should be paid for that time as well, because they're working and you as the employer know about that. And so this is something that, to kind of keep your arms around it, we think you should be having your supervisors keep tabs on when their employees are working. And so if you have supervisors that know one employee is doing a lot of off the clock work and after hours work, that should be showing up in their time card if they're a non-exempt employee. And also for non-exempt employees, even when they're working from home, they should be getting their proper meal and rest periods that they're entitled to under California law, and to reduce any potential liability for missing those periods for the employer. One of the other big areas that we've seen clients have a lot of questions about are business expenses. And California law requires employers to reimburse their employees for all necessary business expenditures or losses incurred by the employee in direct consequence of the discharge of his or her duties. So this can obviously encompass a lot of things. And right now, that includes electricity, not necessarily electricity, but internet is one of the big ones that we're seeing clients reimburse their employees for, particularly when their employees are required to work from home, because they don't have a choice of whether they're coming into an office or not. So these employees aren't making an affirmative choice to work from home instead of coming into the office. And under those circumstances, you're typically going to have to reimburse your employees necessary business expenses, which would include something like internet that's required for them to work. And so there's a couple ways that clients and employers have been dealing with this. We've had some clients that are just providing a straight stipend where they say, we're going to give employees an extra $30 or $40 at the end of every month, and that should cover the portion of their home internet bill that needs to be covered. And that also puts the ball in the employee's court. If whatever is being reimbursed does not cover that, the employee can then follow up with a supervisor of human resources to say that what they're being reimbursed for does not necessarily cover the expenses they're incurring. We did get one question about employers that are allowing employees to work from home, but also requiring those employees to come in, whether it's 1 day a week or 2 days a month, and whether the employer has to provide travel time pay to those employees coming into the office, or mileage reimbursement for those employees that are coming in. And under those circumstances where the employer is allowing the employee to continue to work from home, and it's the employee's choice to continue to do that, the employer would not need to be reimbursing the employee for the mileage costs or the travel time to come into the office for the 1 or 2 days a week or 1 or 2 days a month that the employer is now requiring the employee to come in. And so with a lot of these, as offices reopen and employers give employees the choice to come in, as opposed to requiring employees to stay home, you're going to see some of these business expense reimbursement issues become probably less prevalent as we get more into an environment where the office is open for everyone and the expectation is that you are in the office on a regular basis. One other issue
and I'm gonna, if I can just step in real fast, Nick, the thing I would caution everyone, We are already seeing class actions and PAGA actions with respect to business expenses and whether or not they were reimbursed. There's not bright lines on a lot of these questions and these issues. The key thing, though, is for you as a company to have thought through what the possible business expenses that employees may have incurred that were required to be incurred. And one I'll tell you that a client had is they were not providing printer paper to their employees because their position was, you're not required to print out that report. You may like to do it, and that may be your preferred method of reviewing your work, but we are paying for your internet. We provided you with a computer at home, and that's what, you should be able to get your job done that way. And who knows what the right answer, and that particular client hasn't been sued. They just got the request in from their employees to have that paid. I don't have the answer for you for what your business should or shouldn't do, but I would encourage you to think through it and make that determination now. And if your determination is that that is a voluntary expense incurred by the employee, document that now ahead of time as opposed to after you get the demand letter or the PAGA complaint addressing that issue.
Thanks, Amy. And the last issue on this slide is there are some payroll considerations that employers should take into account in regards to employees who are working remotely but may be working remotely out of state now. Those employees were likely physically present in California, potentially working for you from here before, but for whatever reason have decided that they're going to be working remotely out of state, they have family out of state, or any other issue. And so under those circumstances, there are payroll tax implications, workers' comp issues that should be taken into account, and unemployment insurance issues in the state where that employee is now working from. And so employers should have policies that require their employees to alert them of their relocation or require them to stay in state if that's something that the employer doesn't want to have to deal with going down the road.
And by the way, I'm sure a lot of you do have those policies in effect, but now is the time where it may actually really, you might want to check up on that and make sure that someone, whether it's in your payroll department or elsewhere, is somewhat monitoring that and occasionally checking on that if you are going to continue in this remote world with people. It doesn't always come to people's mind right away, but it is something that different cities and states are looking at because they're concerned about losing their tax revenue. And so it has risen to the level of bringing the attention and garnering the attention of the taxing authorities. So you just want to keep an eye out for that.
So,
and I'm just going to briefly respond. We did get a follow-up question on the time mileage reimbursement. So keep in mind, you can have different regular locations for work, which is what your question seems to address. Where you would need to start paying is if they were going to more than one location in a particular day. So you can have someone who 2 days a week is working from home and 3 days a week is working in the office, or even that they are working in the office once or twice a month type thing. That on those days would be their regular place of employment, so you would not need to pay for them to drive to work or pay the reimbursement, if that makes sense.
So the next topic we're going to cover is changes to the workspace. And so this is something that has been kind of on every employer's mind since they've brought employees back to the office or back to a physical workspace. And so there's a couple areas where there are current requirements. One of those is from the California Department of Public Health. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, they published guidance for various industries last summer. That guidance is still in effect. And so if your HR department should be looking to that guidance for what they should be doing in the workspace. Various counties have also implemented their own measures. I know LA County has their own office protocol and certain sheets that have to be posted. San Diego, I know, has deferred to the state's guidelines, as has Orange County. And I think Santa Clara County up in Northern California also has their own guidelines that are separate and apart from the states. So you just want to make sure you're checking the jurisdictions that you operate in to make sure you're complying with any local regulations. One of the biggest things that employers need to implement are the Cal OSHA emergency temporary standards. And so I'd say one of the larger requirements in there is that there is a requirement for employers to have some sort of self-screening for COVID-19 symptoms with their employees. And so that can range from, a temperature check to get into the office. It can be an app-based protocol where an employee has an app on their phone and they just check a few boxes before they come into the office saying they don't have any COVID-19 symptoms or they haven't been exposed to anybody with COVID-19 in recent days. But it needs to, under these standards, it needs to be something where the employee just isn't coming into the office without either verifying that they aren't sick or being subject to some sort of questioning or temperature screening prior to coming into the office. There's also new training that is required for all California employees related to COVID-19. Cal OSHA has published their own training, and it can be used if you don't want to develop your own. It's available on the Cal OSHA website. It's about 20 or 30 minutes long, and that would cover that requirement. I think as more people are vaccinated and more offices reopen, you're probably going to see a lot of this dialed down, maybe in the middle or later part of the summer. But in the next couple months, these are things that employers need to continue to think about going forward. So as Amy mentioned, with other issues employers are going to want to really consider going forward are updating their personnel policies. And I think the pandemic and working from home has really kind of exposed areas where employers are going to have to revise policies going forward. And there's a couple areas where that falls into. And so in terms of a confidentiality and privacy policy, a lot of these that were drafted before the pandemic don't really account for a work from home environment. And so employers need to make sure they know what devices their employees are using from home, how they're storing company information at home, and also protecting that information going forward. And this is probably something that isn't specifically addressed in terms of the work from home environment in employee handbooks right now, but it is something that should be addressed going forward. Another area that employers are going to want to consider revising is the remote work policies. And I think there's going to be broad changes in that area for many employers going forward that have decided they're not going to require employees to come in every day, but they may require employees to come in several days a week or several days a month. And so your revised remote work policies should clarify when employees are allowed to work from home, how often they're allowed to work from home, if they need permission from their supervisor or human resources to do so. And the idea with this is it needs to be something that employers can point to for their employees to know exactly what the new work from home policy is going to be going forward. Timekeeping policies should also be adjusted based on this new work from home environment. And this is more going to affect your non-exempt workers, but you want your timekeeping policy to reflect company policy that employees are not supposed to be working off the clock. You should also have something in there that employees should be productive during normal business hours. I know a lot of people, one of the benefits for most people working from home is that they can get their work done kind of when it's convenient for them, before the kids are up or after the kids have gone to bed at night. But if it's important for you and your company that employees are available during business hours, you should have something in your remote work policy or timekeeping policy addressing the fact that the company expectation is that employees are available and productive during normal business hours. In terms of timekeeping policies, if you haven't already for your non-exempt workers, there should be a policy that they're required to record and document all hours worked from home contemporaneously. And it should also make clear the company's expectation that those employees continue to take the required meal periods and rest breaks, and also for the employees to track those periods, because it's almost impossible for employers to do so when the employee is working from home. And lastly, overtime policies should also be revised and adjusted based on this new environment, and emphasizing that unauthorized work or overtime can lead to company discipline, and just encouraging employees to get permission for that overtime if that's the company's policy going forward. I'm going to turn it back to Amy here, who's going to go over the vaccine issue that so many people are dealing with right now.
Yeah, so we're in our home stretch of our hour that we have allotted, and vaccines. We are hearing, you know, you can't turn on the TV or the radio or look at your news feed without there being a story about vaccines, the amounts, who is receiving them, whether they should be required or not. It is noteworthy that very shortly after the new administration took office, there was a 117-page national strategy for COVID-19 response and pandemic preparedness that was revealed, displayed, broadcast, however you want to say it. Notably, it did not include a requirement that Americans get vaccinated. And so that is important to note that the government is not requiring it. And then the question becomes, should employers? And certain venues certainly are. Certain, you know, we just heard today on the news that the cruise industry is going to be permitted to return starting in July, so long as there are 95% of the people that are on board are vaccinated. And so that's a particular industry that comes into effect. One of the big issues of controversy and debate is the fact that currently the vaccines have only been approved pursuant to emergency use authorization. And in that process, that specifically indicates that you have a right to be informed, that you have a right to refuse the administration of the EUA product, and that it has not gone through the typical testing protocols that it might be. A lot of debate about whether that's relevant or not relevant, but where it does become relevant is in your employees' minds as to whether or not they can and should be taking the vaccine, and the implications it has for employers for potential liability if you were to put into effect a policy of mandating it. I'm going to have you switch to the next slide, Nick. This vaccination is a topic that is a hot button topic for an issue for a lot of people. Individuals who have been vaccinated are very, for the most part, very willing to talk about it, to ask questions, to ask other people, to, you know, publish their vaccination card on Facebook and whatever else not. Many people who do not wish to be vaccinated for a wide array of reasons are less vocal about it and tend to be more silent in those conversations. But they oftentimes have equally strongly held opinions about vaccination. And by the way, the office that I'm in, the sun just shifted, and so I can see that the sun is like glaring in my eyes and providing a shadow here around me, so I apologize for that, but we don't have shade, so I can't fix it. In any event, you can see here the EEOC guidance. So there was a guidance issued by the EEOC that does say that it is permitted, and it's a guidance, not not a law that's been put into effect, but it's a guidance, that employers are permitted to mandate vaccines with the requirement that they provide certain accommodations. And those are for disability, for medical conditions, and for religious reasons that the accommodations would need to be considered. Keep in mind that because someone, if you did have a vaccination policy, simply because someone was unable or unwilling to be vaccinated would not mean that you could terminate that employee automatically. It also does not mean that you can automatically bar that individual from coming into your workplace. What you have to engage in is an undue hardship analysis with respect to someone's request for accommodation. And the EEOC guidance goes through what those factors are to be considered. So if you were to have a mandatory vaccination policy, you would, for anyone who requested an accommodation, go through the analysis of determining, does a direct threat of harm exist? What is the duration of that risk of direct harm? What is the nature and severity of the potential harm? What is the likelihood that potential harm will occur? And what is the imminence of the potential harm? And if there were still a direct threat that was determined to exist by someone not being vaccinated and coming into the physical workplace, you then would have to go into the reasonable accommodation analysis process. And it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to deny someone who, for medical, disability, or religious reasons, is not vaccinated from coming into your workplace, because there are many other preventive measures that we have been putting into place for the last, since March of last year, that have proven to be effective. There is social distancing, which is still going to be going on. There is mask policies, which are still going to be going on. There are the self-checks that you must do before you can come into the workplace, which are still going to be going on. And, there is a large sentiment, and I've heard this from many people, well, if we just had a mandatory vaccination policy, then we could all get rid of these silly masks and not have to wear masks in the workplace. That actually is not the guidance currently, and there is still the requirement that there be masking in office spaces. So, recently there was the relaxing of masks for outside situations. It has not been for inside of offices. And, so many pundits out there about when and what will change. But the suggestion is that in office buildings, they are not likely to remove that mask requirement for a long time. And when you get into the deciding who and how you're going to accommodate people who are not vaccinated, you get into the discussion of, if we're requiring someone to continue to work from home because of their inability to be vaccinated, you get privacy issues that come into play about what are you revealing about that person's disability, their medical condition, or their religious observance or beliefs. On the religious observance and beliefs, keep in mind that is not an easy answer either. And routinely, employers stay away from asking about what the religious beliefs are that come into play. In California in particular, it is a very amorphous standard as to what a religion is. It is simply a strongly held observance or belief. It does not have to be even a recognized religion. And currently, even within various religions, there are differences of opinion when it comes to vaccination. So for instance, the Catholic Church, the Pope has come out and supported vaccinations. There are many cardinals and bishops and different high-level clergy throughout the country that are opposed to the vaccinations, and particularly because of the use of stem cells that are tied to abortion in the connection. So you can't simply say because someone's Catholic, they couldn't have a religious objection to it. And very few employers really want to get into that level of scrutiny of religious beliefs or frankly, medical conditions or disabilities too on this particular issue. It's pretty easy to get a doctor if you have a reason not to get a vaccination to write that note. So things to keep in mind. And let's move on to the next slide, Nick. As I'm quickly running out of time here, just to get a sense of what companies are doing, as of February, only 0.5% of companies were mandating vaccines for all employees. And it's a little different. This was not involving healthcare workers, who that is kind of a separate, but this was of kind of office environment survey that was conducted. 6% nationwide were planning to mandate vaccines in the future for some or all employees. 3% were planning to mandate for only certain workers. And it was about 50-50. You can see here, 43% would consider the possibility of a mandatory vaccination policy. 48% said that would never be on the table. They would never consider it. Notably, if you move on to the next slide, Nick, it was interesting. Rutgers University announced that they would have mandatory vaccination for students to be on campus in fall of 2021. I know we're running out of time here, but I thought it was particularly interesting. They did not put in the mandatory vaccination for faculty or staff. It was just for students. Now, whether that's because of their union, because of, who knows, they thought they'd get resistance, I don't know, but it was, there's been a lot of comment on that. And let me take you to this last slide here. What we have been recommending to our clients for the most part, and what our clients have been recommending back to us, has been a best practice to encourage vaccination, to make it easy for their employees to get vaccination, but not to mandate it. And there are a lot of things you can do to show a strong encouragement and policy in favor of vaccination, with issuing statements from the company, with providing detailed information on exactly how employees can get vaccinated, by making sure that there is no cost to the employee if they get vaccinated, either from an out-of-pocket for the vaccination, hooking them up with your health plans and ways to get it, but also in providing paid time off in order to get the vaccination. The federal government just put into effect tax credits that are available to small employers if they provide that paid time off. Also providing paid time off for the side effects of vaccination. If, for instance, you have serious side effects and are unable to work for a certain period of time. You want to be careful. I know a lot of people have said, can we give money to people who get vaccinated, that type of thing. That can actually lead to discrimination claims, because if the reason someone cannot be vaccinated is due to a disability, medical condition, or religious objection, then there is an argument, and the EEOC has acknowledged this too, that would be, could lead to a discrimination claim. And finally, keeping in mind on the mandatory vaccinations, you would have to be consistent across the board and extend that to anyone who is coming onto your facility. So that would mean clients, vendors, other third parties, in order to be consistent across the board. And there is also, and it's unclear, but there are strong arguments that there would be potential liability for the employer if there was a mandatory vaccination policy. And having, heard these, the stories, which are very, very few, for instance, in the Johnson & Johnson, very, very few, but if the reason you got that vaccine was because your employer mandated it, there are arguments, and goodness knows plaintiffs' lawyers will bring them, that the employer would be responsible for both, the immediate effects now. They're also talking about what is the 5-year out plan going to be, what's the 10-year out plan going to be. Is that employer who said you have to get vaccinated, would they be on the hook for them, if there happened to be an adverse reaction that someone had, or if someone was unable to conceive, you'd be dealing with that possibility, and there has not been any type of immunity that has been offered to employers at this time. We are at 1:02, so I apologize that we went a few minutes over. I think we had a few questions that we were able to answer, perhaps one or two that we were not. Feel free to reach out to either Nick or I directly. Our contact information is there on the screen. Always happy for the price of admission to answer any questions you have, not just during this hour, but any other time on any of these topics that we have addressed here today.
I'll just say thank you before anybody asks any of those late questions. Thank you so much, Amy and Nick. Tons of great information. People might ask about getting your slides. I know that's one common question, but thank you so much for everything today.
Absolutely, and you know, it's going to be a process getting back into the workplace and getting people back and comfortable. And again, I just emphasize, you know, be as flexible as you possibly can and as open-minded to listening to what your employees are saying, because there's just a wide range of fears and concerns, all of which are legitimate. And so just be open-minded.